The second speaker is Professor George Coyne from the Specola Vaticana and also a professor at the University of Arizona, Tucson. And he will give us some more perspectives on Galileo's life and the impact of his work.
Right after his mind.
Haven't been pinned like this since my high school prom. I'll get this serious, I promise. Thank you, Cinzia, for the introduction. And thanks to Professor Regini for setting the stage. I will inevitably, we've exchanged some thoughts because we knew that our papers would overlap. We exchanged some thoughts, but there will be some repetition. Repetitio est mater studiorum. That's a little bit of Latin I still remember, and it means, what does it mean? Repetition is the mother of studies. So there will be, but I think there will be a different emphasis and perhaps even contrasting interpretations, which could lead to some nice conversation over the coffee break or lunch. Without further ado, I'm not going to read any of this at you, but I am going to comment. I think it's very important to have a bit of an historical background preceding the time of Galileo, because all of these matter very much. You've already heard from Professor Regini. I emphasize the fact that Aristotle insisted upon doing natural philosophy, or what we would call physics, or the natural sciences today, and he was not just a mathematician. He didn't think that. This difference will become very essential. Essentially, it's inherited from the time of the Pythagoreans that mathematics was just an expedient for understanding positions, eclipses, etc. But it was not an attempt to understand how the universe really works. Okay? The other great thing is, of course, Ptolemy. And in Ptolemy, it's pure math. I am simplifying, for purposes of getting through this, fictitious mathematical spheres. So Ptolemy, as you well know, had all of these spheres. They were fictitious spheres, because for Aristotle, who had these spheres, there were problems. Once we discovered comets that came down through these spheres, how did they do it, for instance? So there's a real difference in the sort of philosophical take with respect to mathematics and the philosophy of nature, or physics, or natural sciences as we know it. Well, of course, the great Martin Luther, breaks with Rome, and this will have a real significance for the Galileo case, particularly in the interpretation of Scripture. In 1543, we have Copernicus' De Revolutionibus. Copernicus was not the first, by any means, to propose a sun-centered universe. Aristarchus may have been the first, or there may have been others. So way back in the time of the Greeks, a sun-centered universe had already been proposed. In 1546, we have the fourth session of the Council of Trent, which treated, among other things, of scriptural interpretation. The main issues that arise from all of this, that are lurking behind the scenes, if I may, from all of this prehistory to Galileo, are Copernicanism, heliocentrism, threatens Aristotle, and it threatens the interpretation of Scripture. Two principal factors: Scripture and Aristotelian philosophy. And the other is what I've just mentioned, the meaning of hypothesis. Is hypothesis simply, this is hypothetical Galileo? That is, it's just a mathematical expedient to explain things, It doesn't talk about the real universe. Or is it hypothesis in the sense that we use it today, we scientists? That is modeling. The best scientific explanation we have today for all the facts we have today. Is Big Bang cosmology true? It's the best scientific explanation we have for all the facts we have. Is neo-Darwinian evolution true? It's the best scientific explanation we have today for all the facts we have. Which sense of hypothesis dominates? The Galileo Commission accused Galileo, although he was one of the pioneers of modern science, of not accepting Copernicanism as hypothetical. That is what I call dirty pool, because hypothetical has this ambiguity about it. I'd like to present a few of the characters. Professor Regini has presented a lot of other characters and placed a rather severe judgment on some of them, like the poor Medici family the Medici family were supporting Galileo, so he would never support, of course, your opinion about Christina the Medici, or his money would be cut off. Ptolemy, this is just a depiction of Alexandria. Ptolemy is the great figure for many centuries, of course, with his Almagest. He has a lady friend, okay? That's insignificant to my talk, but it's interesting. What I like to say to my students is all that Ptolemy had were sticks, okay? All he did was triangulate, measure angular distances between objects, saw the 5 objects that moved among the fixed stars. So all he was doing, all anyone did, essentially, again I'm summarizing up until the time of Galileo, was what we would call positional astronomy. The other great character, of course, is Copernicus, and there's his system. Oh, by the way, Copernicus does not have a lady friend because he was a cleric, okay? He was a canon of the church. Galileo, you've seen this picture, and a much nicer colored picture of it. What I'd like to point out is the date here, 1624. You're going to find out in a moment that 1616 was a critical, time in Galileo's life, as was 1633. 1616 is called the first trial. It was not a trial. If it was a trial of anything, it was a trial of Copernicanism, and Galileo was never mentioned, okay? But 1624, it's kind of interesting. This is after 1616 and before 1633. So Galileo is in his career after the condemnation of Copernicanism, moving forward towards writing his dialogue. And I don't think I'm excessively using my imagination. That Galileo here is very confident, and he's very, very taking on the church. Let's put it that way, okay? And I think this is very true of Galileo in this period. He is a bit defiant with respect to what the church is saying about Copernicanism. Here is Galileo much more tranquil, peaceful. That's because he's dead. This is sitting on top of his tomb. I point this out, however, to note philosophus et mathematicus. Galileo insisted from his very early days that he was both a philosopher and a mathematician against the background of what I've just said to you. He insisted he was not just doing triangulations, he was not just using mathematics to predict eclipses, he was trying to understand how the universe worked. Another principal figure is Cardinal Bellarmine, and you'll see why he's a principal figure in a moment. Cardinal Bellarmine has a halo around him. You notice that neither Galileo nor Copernicus nor Ptolemy had halos around them. I'll say a bit more about Galileo. And another principal figure, believe it or not, is God. I throw this out here for discussion later on. Their concept, including, I think, Galileo to a certain extent, but with some reserve on the part of Galileo, that God, the creator of the universe, carefully designed the universe. Carefully designed it. This hangs over to our day. Would I, as a scientist, not a religious believer, as a scientist, accept that God is a designer? I will not, as you'll see in a moment. I think that belittles God. I'm not judging the people of those days, but it belittles God to have created a universe that works like a washing machine or a car. But let's leave that be. That's a distraction. So, the two themes, Aristotle's physics and natural philosophy, consisted of the 4 principal elements, and as you have already heard, the heavenly bodies and the earthly bodies divided. what I would characterize it as, and it's obviously not an accusation, but that there was a lack of observations, and I'm going to insist upon that. It was only positional astronomy. Aristotle had no observations to support that the only four elements were earth, air, fire, and water. It was just a philosophy, not a philosophy of nature, but just a philosophy. Okay, let's enter into the scripture controversy real quickly. Trent said that there is no private interpretation of Scripture, as you have heard. This is such a critical point in the Galileo history that I would like to read the sentence of Trent about Scripture. Furthermore, to control petulant spirits, that's good ecclesiastical language, by the way, the council decrees that no one relying on his own judgment and distorting the sacred scriptures according to his own preconceptions shall dare to interpret them contrary to the sense that Holy Mother Church gives them. So that's the sentence of Trent. So that's pretty severe with respect to any private interpretation of Scripture. Galileo, as you'll see in a moment, privately interpreted Scripture correctly. The church, only after 400 years, found out that Galileo was correctly interpreting Scripture and issued the first encyclical about the interpretation of Scripture according to form criticism and all of that. Bellarmine's views, very briefly on this, the date is important, okay? It's 1 year before 1616, okay? And he gives primacy to Scripture. He is interpreted, Bellarmine, as being very open-minded because what he says in his letter to Foscarini is that we should literally interpret Scripture. However, should scientists find proofs, whatever proofs are, I don't know, but should they find proofs for anything that seems to contradict Scripture, we should go back and reinterpret Scripture. With respect to Copernicanism, he applied this rule. But at the end of this letter, having said, if we find proofs for Copernicanism, we're going to have to reinterpret the book of Joshua, etc., all the statements about the sun in Scripture. But at the end of the letter, he essentially says, I'm not quoting him, but you'll never find proofs. Well, it's nice to be open-minded and say, if you find proofs, but you never will, we will reinterpret Scripture. I'm characterizing this a bit, but I think I'm giving a correct interpretation of the letter to Foscarini. Galileo wrote 2 letters, first of all to Castelli, and you saw on the film some of that nice dramatic interchange with Christina, etc., about this. Galileo's essential response in these 2 letters, the first one is a bit more primitive. The second one to Christina is more thought out and very carefully done. He gives no primacy to Scripture and no primacy to science because he says essentially they don't meet. There is no science in Scripture. 0. And he's correct. The Judeo-Christian Scriptures were written between about 5,000 years before Christ and 200 years after Christ, from the prophets Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, up until the Gospel of John, which is the last written book of the Judeo-Christian Scriptures, okay? Modern science, born with Galileo and his colleagues, came to be in the 17th century. There are 1,500 years or so between the closing of the books of Scripture and modern science. There is no science in Scripture, and Galileo knew it. He used the cute little phrase, which, by the way, he borrowed from a cardinal, Cardinal Bellarmine. And he said that the Scriptures were written to teach us how to go to heaven and not how the heavens go. It's a beautiful phrase in Italian, of course. So be it. That's Galileo, Bellarmine, etc., and Trent on Scripture. In 1616, so I've been focusing on this date because it's central, the judgment of the Holy Office, okay? The sun-centered universe, you can read it, is absurd. Why is it absurd? It contradicts Aristotle, okay? And it's formally heretical. Why formally? Because they can't say these guys are both theologians and lawyers, some of the worst lawyers you would have ever met. They're all not, well, I should shut my mouth about lawyers. Formally, because it contradicts Scripture, which does not make it necessarily heretical, because we may have to reinterpret Scripture, etc. So they're using their language very carefully. Nonetheless, it's a pretty serious condemnation of Copernicanism, of sun-centered universe. And see how careful they are? They distinguish between the sun and the earth, okay? The earth moves about, is absurd. It contradicts Aristotle. So there's no doubt about it, okay? But they're very careful. They say it's at least erroneous in faith because Scripture speaks a lot less about whether the earth moves or not than it does the sun. And they know that. They know their Scriptures very well. The point is they're implying in each one of these that Scripture is teaching us something scientifically about the sun and the earth. That's their implication, that's their assumption, and they're wrong. They're simply wrong. What happens after this judgment of 1616? Well, it becomes very interesting because Galileo was actually a good friend of the popes of that time, both Paul V and especially Urban VIII, who was the pope at the final condemnation of Galileo. They were both friendly with Galileo. Furthermore, although there's very little politics in the church, they well knew that Galileo was well known. 1610 is the publication, as we'll see in a moment, of his Sidereus Nuncius, his telescopic observations. He was known around the world, a prominent scientist. For the church to take him on publicly was, to say the least, a big threat to the church. So they were not going to do that. So 1616 did not condemn Galileo. It condemned what Galileo and others were thinking without mentioning Galileo. So Paul V asked Bellarmine, who was a close friend of Galileo. Bellarmine was a Jesuit, by the way. I'm a Jesuit priest. So if you see that I sort of support his canonization, I do, I suppose, for some reasons. Okay, I'm getting off the point. Paul V asked Bellarmine to meet privately with Galileo, and essentially it was to do the following. Galileo, cool it. Lay back. Don't make a big public thing of this because the church has condemned this. And we're not condemning you, but, you can go on, do your work, do your research, etc. Okay, do more telescopic observations. But don't say anything publicly against, an Earth-centered universe because you're going to cause problems for us. So Bellarmine does that, and Galileo accepts that. He says, I love the church. I don't want to get the church in trouble. Times will change. I mean, that's seriously the content of this conversation, okay? However, at this same conversation, you'll see the nature and outcome of that meeting. At this same conversation, the first tells you what I just told you. The second, two conflicting reports. As I said, there are no politics in the Vatican. The Pope wanted a private conversation of Bellarmine with Galileo. What happens is Sagizzi, the commissary of the Holy Office, so he's the guy that reports back to the Holy Office, shows up at this meeting. The Pope did not assign him to the meeting. He shows up. And he says to Galileo, I have a document here whereby you are to swear that you will not at all in any way, and then it goes on, teach, research, publish about Copernicanism. This document, in two different versions, is filed away, it's unsigned, and the important thing is it shows up at Galileo's trial in 1633. In fact, he is essentially condemned, not for Copernicanism, but for having disobeyed an order given to him by Bellarmine and by Sagizzi. Galileo plays his cards pretty tight. He immediately goes to Bellarmine and says, Bellarmine, would you give me a sworn statement that I did not abjure to Sagizzi I did not agree to accept what Sagitsi told me. And Bellarmine gives him a document. Okay? This is very convoluted, very convoluted. In fact, I'm not enough an historian to judge it, but it wouldn't surprise me, considers that these documents reporting Sagitsi's conversation are forgeries. But they become very important in 1633 because they are the document that shows that Galileo disobeyed an order. Galileo, at his 1633 trial, pulls out the Testament of Bellarmine, and they don't even want to listen to it. And of course, Bellarmine is dead, and he can't do anything about it. What if Bellarmine was living at the time of the final trial of Galileo? Well, let's turn back before 1616 and go quickly through Sidereus Nuncius, Galileo's telescopic observations, because they're critical to any discussion we'll have. By the way, Sidereus Nuncius, correct me please, my Italian colleagues, is translated best in English as starry message and not starry messenger, where it's almost always translated messenger. It's a small difference. I think messenger would be Sidereus Nunciaturus or something like that. It's the starry message. But that aside, I would claim that it's the first new data in 2,000 years. Galileo, as it were, listened to the universe, let the universe speak to him about its nature, and did not impose on the universe earth, air, fire, and water, and all these philosophical ideas. He let the universe reveal itself to him in the first and very primitive way. And I think that's an essential paradigm shift from purely positional astronomy, okay, where we, let the universe speak to us? Well, hardly. I mean, you're just studying these positions. Whereas with the telescope, Galileo opened up a whole new way of doing science. Okay? Everything he saw challenged Aristotle and Ptolemy. Everything he saw, as Professor Reghini said very well, it did not prove Copernicanism, but it blasted the hell out of Aristotle and Ptolemy. There were spots on the sun. There were mountains and everything on the moon. There was another center of motion out there, satellites going around Jupiter, etc. And the phases of Venus, which is a very, very interesting observation on Galileo's part. How would you explain that Venus at crescent phase is bigger and at near full phase it's smaller? How would you explain that? What about Scripture? Galileo accepts very much that the heavens proclaim the glory of God. They don't proclaim to us, okay, how they work unless we listen to them in a scientific way. Well, you've seen better pictures of this, but this is Galileo's house in Padua, where he made his first telescopic observations. It's one of the first observatories. Can you imagine standing on a porch there and poking this telescope in those skies above northern Italy and discovering what he discovered? There are his telescopes. You've seen those. This, to me, is always fascinating. Here's a scientist at work. He observes night after night after night, and he notices these little spots are moving with respect to Jupiter as the central feature here. And if you study them long enough and well enough, you'll find out that they're going around Jupiter. And sometimes one or other is behind Jupiter or in front of Jupiter. And that's why this is clearly, he studies it night after night after night and determined even, in a crude way, the period of revolution of these satellites around Jupiter. This is his notebook where it's absolutely fascinating. He didn't have a CD or any electronic systems. He didn't even have a strip chart to record. He just had to write and observe, make sketches, etc. And that brought about his discoveries. There are the moons today that we know so well. He observed the moon, as you've seen. He cleverly observed it at half moon so he could get long shadows. And in fact, he studied the elevation of craters on mountains on the moon by triangulation, by the length of their shadows, etc. I mean, this is absolutely amazing when you figure the years in which he did it. He observed the Milky Way. This is a modern picture of the Milky Way. He observed it. He marveled at it. He writes a sort of intuition that the sun must be one of these many stars out there in the universe. That's his thinking about it. He doesn't have the slightest idea of our galaxy or the fact that there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe, obviously, but he has a wonder about where the sun fits in to this big picture. Finally, Galileo writes his dialogue in publishes his dialogue in 1632. In this, would someone... Good, thank you. I was just going to ask you to do that. I was going to ask you to stand up and swat flies, but I now know. There are three characters in Galileo's dialogue. It was very typical literary genre for writing about a scientific topic in those days. And the three characters, Salviati is Galileo, Sagredo is Ptolemy, and Simplicius is the interlocutor. Now, Galileo, he almost hung himself because of his character, his contrariness. He must have been an extremely interesting guy. I would probably want to have a drink with him, but not a second one, because he was... He puts in the mouth of Simplicius, in every Romance language, it's very easy to move from Simplicius to simpleton, right? He puts in the mouth of Simplicius the very words that Urban VIII had spoken to him when they were walking in the gardens, friends conversing. Now, what were those words? Urban VIII said to Galileo, Galileo, what's all the excitement about? He said, whether the sun is at the center or the earth is at the center, it makes no difference. God could do whatever he wishes. Well, Galileo immediately, I don't think he contradicted Urban VIII on the spot, but he immediately said, forget science. There is no sense in studying a universe that has no permanent, at least according to our view of it, permanent rational structure. You know, I come up with a model today of the Big Bang, and tomorrow God changes his mind. Well, I'm not going to do science. I'm going to sit under a palm tree and drink tequila. I mean, it's, you know. So that whole idea of a voluntarism, that God could do whatever he wants, Galileo puts in the mouth of Simplicius. Well, Urban VIII found that out, and he was not very happy. So trouble is brewing. This is the frontispiece to the dialogue. I show it because there are three figures here, as in Galileo's dialogue, three figures. But these are Aristotle, Copernicus, and Ptolemy, you know, is in the back there. Galileo insisted that his dialogue was just weighing the arguments for Earth-centered, sun-centered universe, and he was not taking sides. You're kidding. I mean, even from the frontispiece, Aristotle is pointing to Copernicus. He's saying, I give up, Copernicus. You guys have beat me down. You know, my natural philosophy is all. And Ptolemy is stuck in the background. Galileo's dialogue, anyone that reads it, is publicly preaching, it's preaching to a certain extent, Copernicanism. And there it is. He has the satellites going around Jupiter, the moon going around the Earth, and the sun at the center. By the way, Galileo always, to the day of his death, accepted circular orbits. It's strange. You know, it's a mixture here. He's tearing down Aristotelianism, but he's continuing to accept one of those ancient prejudices that the heavenly bodies are perfect and move in perfect motions, and that was a circle. He cut off correspondence with Kepler when Kepler told him, I've discovered elliptical orbits by using those that long data files of Tycho Brahe. So positional astronomy had its place. It's led Kepler to the discovery of ellipses. Galileo cut off correspondence, and never accepted elliptical orbits. Had he would not. Galileo needed epicycles. This is one of the motions they were trying to explain, obviously, the retrograde motion of the planets, okay? How did they explain it? Ptolemy explained it by his epicycles in deference, everything going around the Earth in circles upon circles upon circles. It explains it, and it explains it today if you do enough careful mathematics. Is it correct? Well, one of the judgments that grew out of the birth of modern science upon what is true in science is simplicity, economics, in the scientific sense. You make as few assumptions as you have to get the most explanatory power. So you have to assume some things. I have to assume that the law of gravity works out there in the Andromeda Galaxy. That's a pure assumption. I can't prove it. But getting off the point, is this the most simple economical way? It's a way. It's a very accurate way. Is it the best way? Is it the way the universe is going? Well, in Galileo's system with a sun-centered universe, we know how he explains retrograde motions, that the planets are looping one another as they go around. So sometimes Mars is in front of us, sometimes Mars is behind us. At any rate, coming to the end here, this is where Galileo was condemned. This is a Dominican convent. Had nothing to do with the Jesuits, okay? People tell me, you Jesuits ganged up on Galileo in those days. I tell them, I'm a Jesuit. If you get 3 Jesuits together in one place, you're going to have 10 different opinions. So there is no way they could gang up on Galileo. And they did not. The Dominican convent on the second floor, Galileo was condemned. The Romans are great. This obelisk you can't see here sits on the back of an elephant. This is Piazza della Minerva. That elephant's head faced towards the convent, and his other end faced towards us. After the condemnation of Galileo, he was a great hero to Italians, but to Romans, okay? They had the elephant turned around so that that part of the element faced the Dominican convent. They were very clear in their opinion about some of the decisions of the church. Well, I'm going to ask a question in the last moment. What does this have to do with the future, with today and the future, this whole discussion of Galileo? Anything at all? Well, the future, you can make of it whatever you want. You take, as Peanuts does, as Susie does here, take a blanket. You can make a penguin out of it. You can make an airplane out of it. So I don't pretend to be able to say from what I know of the past and today what the future will be like, because I can make anything out of it I want. But that does not stop me from saying a few things. First of all, authority in the church and authority in science are very different. They are by their very nature. Authority in the church is top-heavy. I'm not criticizing it, okay? But you saw the Council of Trent's statement, okay? Okay, that is not atypical of the church. The church declares what is true. Now, honestly, to be honest, it does it in very small matters, and they have to be very important matters of faith and morals. Nonetheless, when it does it, okay? So authority comes from on high. I'm simplifying things. In science, as best I know, the facts, the data are authority. If this data is best explained by this theory or modeling, that's what's true. If tomorrow we get more data and we have to refine it, that's what's true. They're very different. I'm not saying necessarily conflicting, but maybe I am. The question is, what happened to Galileo, could it happen again? And I certainly can't exclude it. And Lord knows today there are many issues that concern science, okay, that could cause a conflict. The other is the contrast between public opinion and the community of scholars. Scholars, for purposes of discussion, I'm limiting to scientists and interpreters of Scripture. Theologians interpret Scripture, okay? It's no secret I'm not in that part of America where I'd have to be careful about saying this, but the popular opinion in the States that swings, okay, from very fundamental religious belief to very liberal religious belief is widespread in this country. And no doubt about it, it's a big problem for our society. The fundamentalist, literal interpretation of Scripture, creationism, intelligent design movement with its center in Seattle, are all very much a challenge to the scientific community, I think, because they pose as science and they're not. Take evolution, intelligent design today. What would Galileo say? He would not say anything. He'd get the biggest telescope he would and continue to collect data and he wouldn't even listen to these fundamentalists interpreting Scripture that God made the universe in 6 days and worked so hard he had to rest on the seventh. He wouldn't listen to those people. I mean, he wouldn't waste his time on it, frankly. That's my opinion. And then the whole, big classical question, chance or necessity? Did everything come about by chance? Well, if it did, who needs God? If it happened by necessity, who designed it? Who necessitated it? According to modern science, and this I'm kind of posing as Galileo. Hey guys, I happen to know from modern science that the universe is fertile. It has 10 to the 22nd stars in it that are spewing out chemistry all the time, so that both chance and necessity are working together in a fertile universe. And that's what brought us about through chemical complexity. That's what modern science has to contribute to this argument. And if you ask me, did God did it? I'm going to say, I don't know. I simply don't know. It would be absurd to say that I found God through any kind of scientific or any purely rational pursuit. If I believe in God, big if, then my modern science may help me to understand what I believe in. I like this statement of John Henry Cardinal Newman that I end with. I think it's he's contemporary of Darwin, by the way. And really against a lot of church thinking in that time. As you mentioned, Professor Regini, the church is not monolithic, so you can't say everybody thinks one way. But he was thinking against the grain, and correctly. Well, we do have problems. We really do. And I think if Galileo were here today, he'd face them strongly as a scientist with that whole big paradigm shift. And you have to observe, you have to let the universe speak to us, okay? But at any rate, if we're running in different directions, that'd be bad, okay? But if we're running away from the same problems, then we may all be running in the same direction, but it's not going to solve anything. So I'd rather hit the fundamentalist religious belief in our country head on. But frankly, it doesn't settle anything. There are a lot of hardheads around, as was the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, or the Holy Office at the time of Galileo. They knew it all. Do you know that judgment of 1616 that I showed you? One day before that judgment, the theologians of the Holy Office were asked to study those two propositions about the sun and about the earth. In one day, they came back with the answer. There was no science. They did not listen to any science. They applied what they knew of Aristotle and what they knew of Scripture to placing that judgment. And they made a huge mistake. But from mistakes, let's hope that we learn. Thanks very much for listening. Yeah.
A very quick question.
Sorry.
Anyone? Perhaps then we...
Back in Galileo's day, science and the church were in conflict. Today, do you see anything that leads you to see a different area of conflict between science and the political environment?
Yes, I think yes. The areas are pretty well known. They mostly arise now from the field of genetics, stem cell research, all of these issues that arise from molecular biology and all of that. The only thing I could say to it is I regret very much, and I've tried to push for it since I'm a scientist working within the church, so that the church would get a better understanding of science, so that when they pass judgment, they pass it upon good science rather than poor science. That doesn't always happen, as in the case of Galileo, okay? And that's a challenge to the church, I think. There's a challenge to scientists to be more, and that's happening. In today's society, scientists are very open to dialogue. I'm not speaking universally for all, but there's a great exchange, okay? There's more, I think, more give from the science side than there is from the church side. And that I regret. But I think it's true.
And we are really out. Let's wait until the break. Let's thank George again.